My name is Steve Zwick, and I'll be moderating today's session. I'm the producer of the Bionic Planet podcast, and today's session is, I think, a very exciting one. We're looking at the role of peatlands in combating climate change and the role of finance in supporting peatlands, which is a very important subject. I think most of the people tuning in here already know. And we have a very, very distinguished panel. We'll open up with a series of keynotes laying out the issues. Then we'll go into a panel discussion, and I will introduce the participants at each sequence rather than going through and listing everybody up front. To get us going, we've got Jane Madgwick, who is the CEO of Wetlands International, and she'll kind of lay out the issues for us and get us set up, and then I'll introduce the keynote speakers. Jane, do you want to?
So thank you, Steve, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for getting up early enough to get in for this session, and big welcome from Wetlands International into this session, which is really going to look at how we can unlock private finance for peatlands. So just to set the scene, where are we now? I think we've achieved a lot together. We've established a good knowledge base about the values of peatlands, a good mapping of peatlands around the world. We've started to really connect the science with the policies, and this is gaining momentum through the NDC opportunity that is now. And what I also see is there's growing political will to act. So we heard just last night some new commitments from the Scottish government, and I think these are happening around the world. So this is good, but the reality of it is that if we are really going to meet this net zero by 2050, we need to go much faster. So there's a massive urgency about building on these good foundations and really safeguarding those intact peatlands that are left, number one. But secondly, something around 50 million hectares of peatlands around the world need to be brought back into good condition, mostly by re-wetting. And that is an enormous scale compared with even the biggest of the peatland restoration programs that have been done right now. So that's what we're here to address, this big challenge. Wetlands International, of course, has been working on this around the world for, well, decades. And we've been working on the voluntary standards, connecting with IPCC to make sure that this process is rigorous. We've especially been brokering and forming partnerships between ourselves and government, but also between government, private sector, and local and indigenous communities to enable that there can be a joined up approach to peatland conservation and restoration. And we've been enabling propositions to come forward, like real plans for whole peatland landscapes, and to start to map out the methodology for conserving and restoring peatlands at a landscape scale for the long term. So this is it's a contribution. But we also need to step up. And the fact is that to address this enormous challenge, we're going to need some very big financial flows. And that's why we're here today. This will need a combination of public and private finance, and it's absolutely vital that we bring the private sector in quickly at this moment to help move us forward. That's the opinion of Wetlands International. And of course, it's about the own supply chain of each company and what you can do within your own fence. But we believe that there will always be residual emissions, and these can be offset. That is a need, and it's also an opportunity for peatlands. And there are gains to be made for peatlands at all stages of the mitigation hierarchy. We need to work on all of them now, not one by one. So just to address some of the other tweets and noise around this COP, yeah, this is no free pass to companies to just greenwash through investing in peatlands. No, that's not the way it needs to happen. And I believe also, no, this does not need to be a threat to local and indigenous communities and groups. quite the reverse, because many of those lands which need to be conserved and restored, they are in the hands of indigenous communities, and they are the very best people to take action to conserve those peatlands. So we need to handle this finance in a way that really underpins their rights and their benefits. So looking very much forward to hear the perspectives from all of the speakers today in the panel on the barriers and enabling to scaling up finance for peatlands. And I hope that through this session we can build some consensus and also help to bring some of the doubters and some of the critics along with a solid argument. So I will see you at the end of the session to wrap up, but for now, back to Steve. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And now, as Jane mentioned, we've had some big announcements coming out of the government of Scotland, among other places, and I think nobody is better situated to speak to that than our first keynote speaker, who is Kate Forbes. She is the Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Economy for the nation of Scotland. All right, would it be a nation or?
Absolutely. Although that answer may differ depending on who you ask, but I'm certainly very persuaded. I hope you've enjoyed Scottish hospitality as well while you've been here. It's wonderful to be able to welcome so many people from across the world to Glasgow and to Scotland. And I'm delighted to be here speaking at the Peatland Pavilion this morning and to have the opportunity to talk about an area which we have seen over the last few years make great strides in Scotland. I was the first Cabinet Secretary, I think, to announce substantial 10-year investment in restoring peatlands just 2 years ago. And so it does seem fitting that as a Cabinet Secretary for Finance, and having heard your opening remarks about the importance of leveraging private finance, that I'm able to speak to the issue just now about restoring and protecting global peatlands. Scotland was the first country in the UK to declare a climate emergency and has one of the most ambitious legal frameworks for emissions reductions in the world. We are committed to a just transition to net zero and also, critically, to ensuring that we build a well-being economy. And what's more, we're very conscious of the role that Scotland's rich natural capital plays in all of that. It means that we are ideally placed to lead the way in adopting nature-based approaches to tackling the climate emergency whilst simultaneously addressing biodiversity loss. Approximately a quarter of Scotland's land area is covered by peat, which stores over 3 billion tonnes of carbon. We were joking a little bit earlier that you won't see on Scottish branding that a quarter of Scotland is a bog, but actually it is something to celebrate when it comes to climate change. Peatland habitats also clearly benefit the environment and our communities by supporting biodiversity, improving water quality and reducing flood risk. But we also know, whilst we celebrate that a quarter of Scotland's land mass is peat, we don't celebrate the fact that 80% of Scottish peatlands are degraded, meaning that they are net emitters of carbon. And in fact, they account for around 1/10 of our total greenhouse gas emissions. So we urgently need to address that considerable source of emissions if we are to meet our laudable targets of being net zero by 2045. We have committed over £250 million to restore at least 250,000 hectares of degraded peatland by 2030. And that long-term funding commitment is allowing multi-year and large-scale projects to be implemented, boosting restoration activity and giving confidence to delivery partners in the public, private and third sectors. We know quite clearly that public investment won't be enough, and the transformative level of peatland restoration that's required will need new and additional sources of investment, including a significant contribution from the private sector to meet the pace and the scale of that challenge. We know that there is a gap between the public sector funding that has been committed and the spending required to meet the nature-related outcomes. The Green Finance Institute has estimated that the finance gap for Scotland's climate change mitigation through biocarbon, like peatlands, is currently £9 billion over the next 10 years. So we are working urgently to increase the private investment in peatland restoration and to improve our policies. And I'm sure that many of you won't get beyond Glasgow whilst you're here, but as the constituency representative of a significant amount of that peatland, going to visit some of the private estates to see what they are doing as a direct result of the public sector setting long-term ambitious goals is quite inspiring. There's still, however, a lot of work to be done. And one of the ways in which we are working to leverage responsible private investment into Scotland's natural capital as a whole is through the Peatland Code. This UK-wide scheme offers the certification standard for projects wishing to market the carbon benefits of peatland restoration, and it provides assurance that the carbon benefits being sold are real, they're quantifiable, they're additional, and they're permanent, which are 4 hugely important principles. There's potentially significant appetite from private investors to fund peatland restoration in return for carbon credits, but there are also barriers that we're conscious of that we still need to overcome to unlock that. And we're working with our partners in IUCN UK to boost the contribution of the Peatland Code towards investment in a low carbon economy. In a broader sense, if I take a step back for a moment, we're also well placed to act on the opportunity that responsible private investment in natural capital represents. And I do emphasise, as you will appreciate, the need for that to be responsible, because I think there is a grave risk of irresponsible private investment as well. We are home to an active community of practitioners working on private finance for nature, spanning the private, the public and the third sectors. And we rely on the expertise of our environmental agencies, NatureScot and the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency. Of particular importance is the Scottish Conservation Finance Pioneers Group, established under the banner of the £1 billion for Nature Conservation Route Map, a joint initiative from SEPA, that's the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, and the Scottish Wildlife Trust. We recognise that there are barriers to address in order to attract further responsible capital investment, and we want to make sure that there are capital investments at scale, opportunities that are at the scale required. Keep going. That was a sort of, it's quite weird, isn't it? Because I can't hear myself, but I'm assuming that you can, so I'll keep persevering. But also the risks associated with the investable pipeline, the pipeline of investable projects. So alongside increasing private capital, ooh, hello, how's that? I was praising the guys on the tech desk earlier, because many of you, I'm sure, will be speaking at events where there's some sort of microphone that needs to go down the back of your dress and somehow find somewhere to lodge if it's going to be used. But actually, these nifty little things just park here. But anyway, after that brief interlude, talking more generally about the just transition, I'm always conscious that just transition is never inevitable. It needs to be created, it needs to be fostered, and we need to ensure that there is a just sharing of the benefits of the investment in peatland restoration with our people and our communities as part of a responsible approach. And that is hugely important, because a quarter of that land that we referenced earlier, that is peatland, is also home to communities. So how we restore peatland needs to be based on a just transition approach. And the Scottish Land Commission is taking forward a package of work right now to help us find a pathway to balance the need for private sector investment with community rights and our legal requirement to deliver a just transition. So partnership working is going to be critical. It has already been critical to meeting the investment challenge by mobilising private and public sectors, but also when it comes to delivering the benefits as well. My last comment is just on what we're doing more generally when it comes to building a global alliance for greater integrity, higher integrity, natural capital markets, because the partnership that we're fostering when it comes to peatlands needs to be replicated across the board when it comes to natural capital. And I started by welcoming you all here, not just because I'm delighted that you're enjoying Glaswegian hospitality, but because we are all trying to grapple with these issues across the world. And there will be areas in which Scotland perhaps has pioneered solutions, but there are areas in which other countries have done things that we would very much like to adopt. I don't think it's called plagiarism. I think it's called standing on the shoulders of giants when we share ideas and take the best ones that have been pioneered in other countries. But we do want to exchange ideas and work with partners across the world. We're taking part in a number of events on peatlands to share our experience in this area. And one of my colleagues, Mary McCallan, the Environment Minister, I think will be speaking later on at the Peatland Pavilion. And I'll be speaking later on at the Finance for Nature event that's being held on the banks of Loch Lomond. It's an event that's held in partnership with the Scottish Government, but also a number of other international organisations, bringing together high-profile investors, project owners and key policy players. So that was just a very quick whistle-stop tour of what we're doing in Scotland. If I were to summarise it quickly, it's firstly, from a policy perspective, providing high-level assurance of where we want to go and the public sector funding that's available. Secondly, mobilising and private capital and providing easy opportunities for responsible investment. And the third element is ensuring that just transition applies to not only how we leverage in the private capital, the responsible private capital, but also how we share the benefits between communities and other interests. And we still have a long way to go. We've started on the road. There are big opportunities in Scotland. It must be done if we are to meet net zero, and we're absolutely determined to meet net zero. So thanks very much for joining us this morning.
Okay, thank you very much. So that was, I think you gave us a lot of good fodder for the discussion we'll have after the keynotes are done. And we just heard here about the ecological and the financial importance of peatlands, and also the role of environmental finance in supporting them, and the importance of integrity in ensuring that the finance actually flows where it's supposed to. And I can't think of any country that has done more on this effort to incorporate performance-based payments into ecological restoration than Costa Rica. So, and our next guest can speak to that. Speaking on behalf of Andrea Meza, the Minister of Energy and Environment for Costa Rica, is Advisor Ricardo Ulate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to Wetlands International and the rest of organizers for inviting the government of Costa Rica to provide some ideas on this really important issue that has convened today to all of us. Let me start by thanking the Secretary of Finance of Scotland, for that really inspiring words and the leading role that Scotia is taking on this issue. Definitely, there are big differences between what you just described and the reality in many, in particular, developing countries, where we are at a very early stage of deploying concrete actions related to peatlands in general. In many of our countries, we have not yet, completed the mapping of those ecosystems. We are still having, a lot of gaps. In Costa Rica, for instance, we just completed the mapping of the wetlands in the country. The peatlands is even more complicated because even the people have not put attention to what a peatland means. What is the importance? What is the ecological importance of a peatland? And they don't care about the activities they develop there. So this is something that has been taken into account in the wetland inventory, and we are starting to identify at least the most important and larger areas of peatlands in the country. But it also implies other challenges on the future. Peatlands are really, a key element for increasing ambition in the future. It is a very, very rich pool of carbon, but in many countries, due to the lack of knowledge, the lack of science, the lack of research, these are not even being taken into consideration in the national greenhouse gas inventories. So this is something that we need to start working on, because they have also the potential to contribute to additional ambition in our commitment towards achieving the emission reduction goals that the Paris Agreement requires. And that's also, the first step to start designing a kind of national strategy to generate additional funding to invest in the peatland ecosystems. But according to the IPCC, as you may be aware, you need to be able to provide robust historic data in order, to create the methodological conditions to, present finally and apply, the most recent guidance from the IPCC to be able, to start deploying additional funding from carbon sources, for instance, from carbon markets and so on. So this is a challenge. But in the meantime, the good news, at least in the case of Costa Rica, is that we have already, developed the payment for ecosystem services scheme, which is a model that has been applying particularly for forestry recovery, forestry restoration and conservation in private lands, which is a limitation of the scope of the forestry fund. Because it is supposed in the same law that in public lands, the government will have to allocate the funding, to conserve and restore and sustainable manage those forests. But that's not necessarily the reality, because the public funding is always limited, and not all public areas are being protected, duly protected using the public funding. Then the Forestry Financing Fund is providing through the PES support to the private sector, private lands, but that is also not enough. So we have been working very closely with international organizations like the FCPF, the GCF, and many others, potential sources, in order to mobilize more resources toward the sector, toward the public sector, in particular the forest sector, which includes the mangroves in Costa Rica, according to the national definition deriving from the forestry law. But unfortunately, this does not cover peatlands and any potential finance to be derived, for peatlands conservation or restoration. But the good news is that we are, and our friend Carlos Manuel started this work 2 years ago when he was still the Minister of Environment. We are now entering into the design of the PES 2.0 scheme, which is a new approach, for the payment for ecosystem services that will have two main characteristics. One is that this is not going to be limited to investment in the forestry sector, in order to cover activities, environmental activities, conservation of resources in all other areas of the national policies. And secondly, it is not going to be limited only for investment on the private lands, but will allow to work together with the communities, with the private people, with other public institutions in addressing specific challenges deriving from the lack of funding to be mobilized for many important and rich ecosystems like mangroves, peatlands, and others. On the other hand, well, and of course, this is the room that we are thinking in further designing and developing to start increasing our investments on peatlands as well as in other ecosystems. But again, we have, some limitations, some legal limitations, some policy limitations. We don't have a peatlands policy framework, for instance. We don't have, we have the wetlands, but we don't have, a peatland specific framework. We are starting to develop that. We don't have any policy program that is oriented towards increasing the awareness of the private owners of the land that contains peatlands. And in order to do that, we need to provide them also a solution, a kind of what benefits you are going to derive from restrictive activities that cannot be deployed in those areas because as such peatlands, as wetlands, are considered protected areas. So no economic activity is allowed there. We also have another instrument that it has been very, very important, to deploy private funding to the conservation sector, is the National Program for Carbon Neutrality, which is a voluntary commitment that the business industry can do in order to contribute to the national decarbonization goals. And through that mechanism, those companies, for instance, that cannot reduce their emissions to become neutral, carbon neutral, they can compensate those emissions by investing in conserving and protecting specific goods and services, including peatlands. And this could be another, important source of investment for conservation of peatlands in our country. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And very interesting to see that even a country like Costa Rica, which is so advanced in payments for ecosystem services, is still just beginning to incorporate peatlands. And our next guest can actually pick up on the Carlos Manuel Rodriguez. He is, but prior to that, he was the environment minister of Costa Rica. He helped develop or was instrumental in creating these payments for ecosystem services programs. I'm very interested to hear what he has to say about how this all plays out at a global level. Thank you.
So thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here at the Peatland Pavilion with our good friends of Wetlands International. As I was introduced, I'm the new CEO of the GEF, which is the largest, by far, environmental fund of the planet. And as you can all understand, the first thing I said to my staff was, I would like to see how much we invest in peatlands. And that information is not available. We don't know at the GEF. Building on the lines of the representative of the government of Scotland, and congratulations for your commitment and your passion behind it, and on Ricardo Zulate, we have a big task to deal with because peatlands are not being reflected anywhere we go and anywhere we invest. On the contrary, we are investing a lot in destroying peatlands. That is very clear to all of us. So as I was hearing them, and as I was thinking inside my organization, for us in the GEF, peatlands are really important as wetlands, as protected areas, as biodiversity. Unfortunately, we are a financial mechanism that responds to the country's commitments to the conventions and their priorities. And if this is not coming to us, we have a limitation to really provide the right funding for the right management of these unique, very valuable ecosystems. And just, of course, we got a lot of scientists in the GEF that really recognizes the importance of peatland and wetlands, and we do our best to help countries come up with a consistent, coherent set of priorities in terms of managing all resources. Unfortunately, even though we allocate $1 billion a year, we have to distribute this with 150 countries. So you can do the math. It's not enough money. In some countries, we are allocating $4 million. Some countries, we are allocating $200 million to implement the Rio Conventions plus the chemical conventions and waste. Even though we are the largest supporter of biodiversity funds in the planet through a multilateral mechanism, we provide just 0.5% of the global investments in biodiversity conservation, 0.5%. We are allocating around $500 million every single year in biodiversity conservation. And this is not just whatever the country come up to us. This has to respond to a very well-crafted design process that implements the Biodiversity Convention. And this is key. And if in the Biodiversity Convention, peatlands are not coming up to us, wetlands are not coming up to us, they will not be reflected in the projects that we work with. If peatlands are not coming from the Climate Convention, they will never be there in the front line of what we do with countries. So a couple of things here are really, really important as we deal with this reality. Let me talk a little bit about a couple of big challenges that we have to deal with as we look forward in implementing the Paris Agreement, as we look forward in implementing our goals for land neutrality and landscape restoration, and as we hope we have a strong, ambitious new biodiversity framework. We need to deal with two things. One, we have a huge market failure. We invest many more times financial resources in activities that contribute to biodiversity loss and climate change than what we invest in taking care of nature. And the numbers are very clear. We invest 142 times more financial resources in activities that generate deforestation than what we invest in forest conservation. So at the end of the day, it's not an issue of putting more money. Here, this week, we're talking about $100 billion. $100 billion sounds like a lot of money, but this is 7.1 of what we should be mobilizing today to be on track with a 1.5% decrease. So it's not that much of mobilizing resources from all sources, the big challenge, rather than generating policy coherence at the country level. And if the market is not on our side, we'll continue being very incoherent in how we develop development policies by which we got large amounts of investments in the wrong direction. And of course, we'll be losing wetlands and peatlands and forests and natural ecosystems, whatever natural ecosystem. It can be from grasslands all the way to highly diverse, wet tropical forests. The market is unable to reflect the benefit of keeping those healthy ecosystems, providing us with healthy environmental services. And we knew this for many years ago, and we've been trying in this convention and other conventions to deal with that market failure. REDD+ isn't a good example to do that. This gentleman over there, Ricardo Latte, was an early founder of the coalition of the Costa Rica, Papua New Guinea coalition to avoid deforestation. Eventually it was called REDD, then REDD+. Now we need to talk about REDD+ 2.0, because REDD+ doesn't recognize the value of carbon stocks in wetlands, in peatlands, in the productive landscape, just in forest and tree plantation. We need to move towards a REDD+ 2.0. But again, the issue is that the economic system continues to reward those investments that destroy nature and generate emissions to the environment. And that is a big challenge. We need to map at the global level all of the wrong investments and decision-making processes that we are doing. Today here, yesterday I heard the head of the development bank saying, we are not investing anymore in those activities that contribute to climate change. That means they are not going to, finance oil and gas and many other things, as it was the greatest thing they can do. This is the minimum they can do. The great thing that they can do is to fully finance the transition. Fully finance the transition. Because those development banks, which the main mandate is to do poverty alleviation and narrow the global income gap, will never achieve any progress if they don't invest heavily and strategically in the transition, in the many different transitions. Here we talk about the carbon transition or the energy transition. In the CBD, we talk, the land use transition or whatever other transition. But the point is that, and excuse me if I don't talk that much about peatlands, but this is the overall framework that we need to understand so we can put the peatlands and the wetlands where we need them to be, which is in the front line of solutions. So we need to really understand that the decision-making processes that private sector and public sector uses is basically using economic information. They want progress, prosperity, well-being, but the system is feeding them with the wrong information. Governments, they use national accounting system and GDP, and those systems doesn't recognize the value and the services of the natural capital. If you pollute your rivers and lakes and destroy your forests, that is not reflected in your economic performance, so they will continue doing the same thing. And the same thing happens in the private sector. And here we see the private sector as the magical solution. They will put a lot of money into the solutions. I mean, private sector is not a huge philanthropic organism. Private sector goes where the money is. And in order to go where the money is, government needs to create the incentives. And the incentives are relatively clear. You need to tax the good, the bad things, and untax the good things. Unfortunately, the system is so perverse, and I'm just going to give an example with the taxation system. We tax everything nice, beautiful, productive we do in our society. They tax my income, my property, my transactions, the good things I do, but they don't tax on the bad things I do. That is a huge market failure. And in order to change things, we need to fully internalize the negative externalities. So if companies are polluting with plastic or polluting with emission, they need to pay for that, okay? But on the other side, if companies restore and protect, they should be compensated, and compensated with the right price. We are, Costa Ricans and others, the largest owners of the carbon stocks in the planet. We created this system to be fully compensated for the carbon sequestration services, and we are being paid $5 a ton. That is an insult to a nation that is trying to do their best effort. $5 a ton. The cost of opportunity of doing cattle ranching is $40 per hectare. Or, let me put it in other terms, in Costa Rica, it costs $17 to offset a ton of carbon, and the market, voluntary market, is paying us $5. This is the great idea that we were able to come up with in this convention to solve the deforestation land use change. And if we talk about, and we talk about forests because there are no schemes, there are a few very interesting, small, isolated, PES on carbon on wetlands and peatlands, very isolated. But we need to be able to generate the right prices so we can have the market on our side. So that's one challenge. The other challenge is the institutional failure. We got too many agencies at the country level dealing with many natural resources without any collaboration and complementation. We got an agency on mining, an agency on energy, an agency on biodiversity, and another one on agriculture, working the same landscape with the same stakeholders without any collaboration and with a lot of confrontation. If we believe that we will achieve nature positive 1.5 with the same institutional framework that in the first place created the problem that we want to solve here, we are missing, are not understanding that. We need to move from this institutional structure in our governments that is not providing us with solutions toward agencies that work at the landscape seascape level. Those are the conditions that I strongly believe that we need to understand that will help us achieve our objectives of conservation and sustainable use of wetlands, peatlands, and ecosystem services. This is a vision that we're bringing into the JEF, particularly now that we are working in the replenishment and looking for the next 4 years, where we will have the mandate to implement the agreements, the targets, and the aspiration of the different conventions, biodiversity, land degradation, and the climate change. So thank you so much for the invitation of being able to join you all today. It's really great. And I hope the next COP, I can be invited once more here, and I can give you an account, and I can be accountable to you all of what countries are doing with their peatlands, because today I'm unable, unfortunately, to do that.
Thank you very much. A lot there to unpack, a lot of information about the challenge that lies ahead, and the larger challenge of not only cutting off funding to destructive practices and ratcheting up funding for productive practices that restore wetlands. Our next guest can speak to the latter. The former is probably too big. We'll try to get into that a little bit later, but it's probably might be too big for today's session. But Dee Lawrence is she is the director of Cool Effect and the High Tides Foundation, and she also serves on the Carbon Market Board for the newly named the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. That's the new name, right? And Dee will talk about the role that carbon markets can play in helping to funnel finance into the restoration and protection of peatlands. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And thanks so much to the Wetlands International and the Global Peatlands Initiative. I'm really pleased to be here with you guys today. I also want to give a little nod to Scotland. I myself am Dee MacLeod Lawrence, and I think it's a bit ironic that I'm standing up here talking about peatlands today, because I think that my forebears from the Isle of Skye were probably peat farmers. So anyway, so with that, I'm going to launch into a little bit of a discussion here. First, I wanted to talk about, I have to move this forward. First, I want to talk about why everybody should love peatlands. And I owe special thanks to Dr. Kurt Richardson at Duke University in the United States for helping me with some peat facts. So where does peat come from? So basically, peat is comprised of decayed wetland plants. And they've decayed under a situation of under anaerobic conditions, which means that instead of giving up a lot of carbon into the atmosphere, what they've actually done is they've sequestered it in the decayed material. And this decayed material builds up over time, and that is what creates the peat soil. And in northern, peatlands differ all over the world. In northern peatlands, for example, about 2/3 of carbon is stored in the roots. And so you can see from this diagram here that there's a lot of carbon underneath the soil as well as on top of the soil. So that's kind of the basic story on peat. Some of the other key peatland facts are that, which I think is just amazing, global peatlands are just 3% of the land area, but they hold 20 to 30% of the world's soil carbon. That's about 600 to 700 gigatons. That's amazing. For a small land mass to really capture that much carbon and hold it is fantastic. But what's really bad for peat is draining it, because when you drain peat for conversion to agriculture, what happens is it dries out the peat, and it can cause large fires, which also can release enormous quantities of CO2 into the atmosphere. So it's estimated that emissions from peatland degradation and peat fires release about 2 billion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere every year. That's about 6% of human-caused emissions. And, you know, we believe that the future global concentrations of CO2 really rely on the massive continued storage of the carbon in the peat. So don't drain it. So what can we do? So we're huge proponents at Cool Effect and also High Tide Foundation for carbon offset projects. Carbon projects can help save peatlands. It's a very efficient way to channel finance into these ecosystems that need to be preserved. So what do they, how does that work? So first of all, carbon finance can be a compelling source of income in place of land conversion. In other words, people can be paid from the sale of carbon offsets not to convert the peat to agriculture. And they're only established on lands that are under high threat of deforestation or alternative land use. Otherwise, the project is not deemed additional and it doesn't qualify to become a carbon offset project. It also requires buy-in from local communities because otherwise, you know, as the director of the environment here from Scotland mentioned, if we don't have buy-in from local communities, these projects are not going to survive. So it's very important to channel finance into their pockets. And so we've noticed from our studies of peatlands and from the carbon projects that we represent, they bring microfinance, they bring small businesses, they create opportunities for women, they bring health, they bring sanitation opportunities from the sale of carbon. And, you know, this all adds up to well-being and sustainable livelihoods for these communities. What we really like about carbon finance is it's a really fast, efficient payment for ecosystem services and that for people who are at the bottom of the pyramid. A lot of times government funding takes years to actually get to anyone, and it actually never reaches the people who really deserve it. So are carbon credits bad? Well, there's a lot of people here at this conference that might have you thinking that, but actually research shows that the companies that decarbonize the most are the ones who also offset. And you know, at the end of the day, the purchase of carbon credits has no real impact on whether or not a company is going to pollute. In fact, what will affect the behavior of polluting companies is social pressure, is government pressure, and government regulation, and maybe even in the boardroom. That'll also have an effect. Projects, as I mentioned before, projects are not harming local communities. Instead, they need community support to be successful. And projects don't also inhibit ambition in host countries. As you've just heard from Costa Rica, you know, actually they bring resources where resources are sadly lacking. So no, I don't think carbon credits are bad at all. And so what about integrity? Are these credits real? And we heard from Wetlands International that, you know, a carbon credit is actually, it has to be additional, it cannot be overestimated, it has to be permanent, and it cannot be otherwise claimed anyplace else. And a carbon credit is actually a transferable instrument. It's like a stock certificate. It's certified to represent an emission reduction of 1 metric ton of CO2 or an equivalent amount of other greenhouse gases. And quality has 2 main components. So it's the 4 things I mentioned earlier, but it should also come from activities that don't cause any environmental harm or societal harm in the process of what they do. And last of all, robust documentation, carbon crediting, program diligence, third-party audits, they all contribute to the quality of carbon offsets. There is always room for improvement. And I think as you see data and tech come on stream, you're going to see that these kinds of emission reductions are going to be even better well quantified than they have been today. So, okay, so who's making sure of that quality? Well, there's four organizations. Let's start first with the carbon crediting programs. They've made enormous strides in tightening methodologies, in improving their technical reviews, and asking their VBBs, their verification bodies, to be much more stringent in what they're finding on the ground. And so this is all helping to actually raise up the quality of the carbon projects. As mentioned before, tech and data are coming into play right now. There's satellite data, there's AI that can all help us get a better understanding of exactly where damage is being done and where carbon is actually being conserved. And then there are two new entities that are also contributing to quality. And the first is the one that Steve mentioned that I'm a part of. It used to be called the Task Force. Now it's named the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Markets. And what it has two main purposes. Number one is to direct a lot of private sector funding into global needs for things just like peatlands. And the other thing to do is it really wants to stand up quality. And they're going to do that with members of an expert panel. They have 4 super excellent co-chairs that are going to be able to manage the whole process of reviewing the overall carbon methodologies and figuring out what parts of those methodologies need to be strengthened in order for us to have more confidence in the carbon market. And last of all, the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative works on the demand side. This is where companies are encouraged not to just buy credits that don't actually stand up under scrutiny, that are not truly additional, but instead they must buy real robust carbon emission reductions that actually contribute to a reduction in global warming. And so we're really looking to these organizations to make these things happen. So just to conclude, so what do we need? We need peat for the planet, okay? We need peat to stay in the ground. We don't need it to be dug up. We don't need it to be turned over. We don't need it to be converted to agriculture. We need carbon credit projects to deliver funding to communities to stop conversion to other uses. And we need the voluntary carbon market programs to strengthen and grow in order to create confidence and quality so that the funding can scale. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, I think that wraps up the first part of this session.
Okay.
We're going to watch a short video right now that'll show a little bit more of a structured overview of peatlands and the role and the importance they play, and then we'll go into our panel discussion, which will go on for about a half an hour, and we will be taking. How do we? Do people who are out there know? Like, I guess we'll get into this after. I don't know how do people submit questions. I guess if they're watching, they know, right? On the right-hand side of your screen, if you're watching remotely, you can enter questions. So relax, watch this video, and then we'll pick up with our panel right afterwards.
This is the story of the successful collaboration of many partners and friends working together through German-Russian cooperation to demonstrate the best example of how improved management of peatlands can contribute to the health of our planet, its climate, biodiversity, and hence also the livelihoods of people. Russia is one of the richest countries for peatlands. 1/5 of the country's area is covered by peat, almost 10% with deep peat. 65% of the country's area is covered by permafrost, including peat. Mires accumulate carbon and reduce greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. In case of drought, water stored in mires keeps the groundwater level in the surrounding area high, cools the atmosphere, and humidifies the air. People look for additional space and resources and drain peatlands for different purposes. Over the last 100 years, in the most populated parts of Russia, more than 10 million hectares of peatlands, an area larger than the size of Scotland, were drained. Since 1990, 80% of drained peatlands have been unmanaged and hence are vulnerable to peat fires. Disturbed peatlands become a source of greenhouse gas emissions. They no longer play a role in regulating water and temperature balance.
За годы работы проекта на территории Владимирской области было выявлено порядка 20 тысяч гектар осушенных болот, которые требовали обводнения. Совместно с компанией Wetlands International на территории национального парка Мещера была проведена достаточно обширная работа по обводнению торфяников, порядка 10 тысяч гектар. И местное сообщество очень активно принимает участие в данных мероприятиях. Это не только органы государственной власти и местного самоуправления, но и также общественные организации и волонтерские движения, которые очень активно помогают по обводнению тех торфяников, которые нуждаются в первую очередь в создании той экосистемы, которая была на территории до его осушения.
Climate is a very significant part of the project. In 2017, the project even received the prestigious UN Global Climate Action Award in the category of planetary health. What do the partners think about the role of the project for climate action?
По оценкам специалистов, ежегодное сокращение выбросов парниковых газов в результате мероприятий по обводнению торфяников в Тверской области без учета снижения пожарной опасности составляет порядка 100 тысяч тонн эквивалента СО2. На обводняемом торфянике Галицкий мох выполнена работа по выращиванию биомассы болотных растений.
Я бы выделил все-таки вопросы климатических проектов, они достаточно новые для Псковской области, поэтому очень бы хотелось, чтобы у нас сформировалась команда экспертов именно по этой тематике. В России вопрос формирования рынка углеродных единиц, он становится актуальным. Действительно, эти проекты, они дадут как прямой эффект снижения эмиссии парниковых газов. И в целом они создают для бизнеса большую привлекательность с точки зрения долгосрочных зеленых проектов.
Мы можем демонстрировать на практике, что болотные экосистемы и работа по торфяникам может тоже приносить добавочную стоимость. Дальнейшее развитие этого проекта позволит нам в целом развивать и расширять экологическое просвещение, в первую очередь тех, кто принимает решения, и население, а также молодежь, с тем, чтобы они почувствовали, что болото, болотные экосистемы – это один из важнейших компонентов нашей природы. Поэтому я уверен в том, что у проекта хорошие перспективы. Будем работать.
Okay. So let me just introduce the panel now, and then we'll get into our discussion. If you're watching remotely, you can enter questions. What's that? We're just getting microphones for all the panelists here. If you're watching remotely, you can enter questions into the right-hand side of your screen. We've already got a few questions coming in, so I'm just going to move in pretty quickly, introduce everybody. I've got a few questions I wanted to ask up front to sort of frame the discussion, but I'd really like to try to get to the questions that are coming in from outside. It's interesting, so many questions are on carbon markets themselves, which is good to have. Let me go through our guests here. First is Ligia Castro. Did I pronounce that correctly? Okay. And she's the Director of Climate Change within the Ministry of Environment for the Government of Panama. Then we have Ruben Fietkind. Okay. Always never quite trust the names as I try to speak them here. And he's the Strategy Manager for Green Choice, which is a green energy provider in the Netherlands. Then we have Femke, I should have asked, I always trip over, Tonieke, okay, who is the Program Head for Wetlands International. Then we have Dee Lawrence, who you already know. And then at the end, we have Ed Rumsey, who is a managing partner. She is the Executive Director of Conservation International for Costa Rica. Sorry about that. Okay. So I think what I wanted to do to try to move it along pretty quickly is get right into a couple of framing discussions. And I think I wanted to start with Ruben and Ed, just because you guys are coming at this from the private sector. And maybe you could just talk a little bit about the role, the importance of finance coming in. I'll start with Ed. and then we can move over to Ruben. You can talk a little bit about the strategies that your company has been deploying. So Ed?
Great. Thanks, Steve. Can everyone hear me okay? Good. Okay. I haven't prepared a speech, but I have got a couple of points that I wanted to start with just to kind of frame the discussion. So firstly, I'll introduce Permian Global. Permian is a company that we set up about 15 years ago in 2007 to invest in and develop our own forest carbon projects and programs with a particular special sort of niche. We solely focus in natural tropical forest ecosystems, which includes peatlands and wetlands, mangroves, tropical forests. We're quite different to some others in this space in that we don't tolerate any extraction of timber from natural forests because we really don't believe that that should still be going on. That's an activity that really belongs in plantations and agriculture, that's where we differ from some of our competitors. So where I'd like to start, I'd like to go back to 2017 on the run up to COP23. Does anyone remember where COP23 was? The exotic COP that was in Fiji, the Fijian COP that we all enjoyed in Bonn in Germany. And on the run up to COP23, our friends at Conservation International, along with one of their staff, a chap called Bronson Griscom, published a paper titled Natural Climate Solutions. And the conclusions of that paper were that at that time, only 2% of public climate finance was being directed towards natural climate solutions, whereas it represents around 37% of the cost-effective mitigation potential between now and 2030. Now, that was quite a groundbreaking paper. What that did is it really highlighted that, firstly, we know there's not enough public finance out there, but what there is out there, it's not being directed into this space. And it really did catalyze the private sector to move into this space quite significantly, because what we then subsequently saw from 2017 was, in terms of total issuance in voluntary carbon markets, effectively you could plot an exponential growth curve. In 2017, total issuance was around 40 million tons. The following year, 60, then 90, then 140. This year, we're on track for total issuance over the four main carbon accounting standards of around 350 million tons. So, and that has been driven by private sector demand, which is great. So, as Dee touched upon in her presentation, companies that put finance into developing these sorts of projects and programs, or companies that increase demand by buying verified emission reductions, should be applauded. It's a good thing to do. We should not be chastising these companies for putting money to work in this space. So then we'll fast forward to 2020 and the task force, which I don't think Dee gave herself enough credit there for her and her husband actually putting the money to work and putting that task force together, fondly known as the Carney Task Force on Scaling the Voluntary Markets, or the TSVCM, or whatever you want to call it. We were involved in the initial stages of that task force. And what came out of the first phase of that task force, a group of 80 organizations were put together to debate many different things. And it was a 140-page report, I think, that came out of the first phase, out for public consultation. And for any of you who didn't have a chance to read all 140 pages and take on board all 17 recommendations, I will summarize them for you in one sentence. That's helpful. Effectively, the suggestion was that if we standardize and commoditize emission reductions whilst not sacrificing integrity, it will significantly scale markets. That's it, right? Seems simple. So what we have seen now in the next phases of implementing these 17 recommendations is actually organizations are already putting forward effectively what's a commoditized product, a standard product, which is fungible, it trades on exchanges, and it allows us to see publicly and more transparently what these sorts of products should be priced at. And I can tell you, by the end of last week, these reference contracts were trading at $9.60 a ton. As of this morning, they're up to $10.60 a ton. Now, that really should now be the floor price for an emission reduction traded in voluntary carbon markets. And now we can all see it. There is less inappropriate behavior because people can't go to these projects and programs and purchase offsets incredibly cheaply and sell them on to companies for huge margins, because now we all know what the price is and we know where it's trading. So which is great. And I think the last point I'd like to make would be that what are the implications of this more transparent pricing? Well, This now allows us to look further into the future, and we can try and predict what the price will be going forward. Now, a lot of people in this room, including people on this panel, know very well how to build conservation projects. They know the activities that need to be undertaken. We know how to restore peatlands. The problem has been that there hasn't been sustainable sources of financing. What I would suggest to you now is that there is more demand in the market now than there is supply of verified emission reductions. So if you develop projects, we know what they price at, we know you can sell the credits, you now have what would be considered bankable projects, predictable future income streams. So now it's bank financing, it's institutional finance. And that's probably what I'll stop.
And that actually sets up Ruben fairly well, because what's interesting is Ruben's company, I'll let you describe the strategy, but you guys are not, you're not waiting for supply to emerge. You're going off and trying to proactively restore lands, and you're also not taking a carbon neutral claim. You're kind of going against the tide here. Can you maybe talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So, can everybody hear me? It's kind of strange to hear yourself. Yeah. So I work for a company called Green Choice, which is an energy supplier in the Netherlands. We have about 600,000 customers, mainly household customers, but also a few smaller companies. And we started 20 years ago, and we supply electricity only from renewable sources, so mainly wind and solar. But also the market opened up for companies to sell gas. Like, it used to be a monopoly, but 2004 our company could also sell natural gas, and most Dutch houses are heated with natural gas. So right away there was a dilemma: do we sell natural gas? We're called Green Choice, and we want to sell only sustainable energy sources. And so our founders said, well, okay, we'll sell natural gas, because our customers, they really want both, not have two companies supplying their energy. But then have something, let's invest in forest. At that time was only forest. And with that investment, make the same CO2 impact, but then the other way around, as the natural gas sales. Later on, when the company moved on, we started doing other activities, like selling solar panels. So if basically in the end to reduce the amount of energy that our customers use. And now we move also to electric vehicle services and insulating houses, heat pumps, and all these things. But at the same time, we also started entering the voluntary carbon market, and that's what your question was about. And we started buying huge volumes of carbon credits, because what we did is, per cubic meter of natural gas that we sell, we put aside a little bit of money, and that forms a budget, and we started basically supporting nature-based projects by buying credits. Now, recently we moved in another direction, like you said, and the reason is, when we heard about the whole issues with the Paris Agreement, having also developing countries having their own carbon targets, and a whole discussion about who can claim what. So if a country claims the CO2 impact of a certain project, can you claim it as a company as well? And so when is it additional or not? If it's within the target of that country, it became very, very complicated to make the case of carbon neutrality in our mind. And at the same time, there was a lot of critique on offsets, because it could have the incentive to keep the old economy. If you say to your customers, well, it's okay, you're carbon neutral anyway, so let's just keep using natural gas. So that was another argument to say, well, maybe do we really need the carbon neutral claim? And in the end, we said, well, let's why not drop it and see what happens, but still communicate about all the projects that we support and their impact, not only carbon but also other impacts. And also there was another reason, is that we see now all kinds of companies that we cannot really relate to, like the big oil majors, and also the airlines moving into the same space. And so we would line up in the same in the same lineup with these companies buying these credits. What impact do we make? This is what we asked ourselves. Can we not maximize the impact of the budget that we allocate to ourselves in another way, namely going out there and team up with organizations like Wetlands International, and then we also found that if you look at the amount of impact, you automatically arrive in peatlands or mangroves or the wetlands, basically. So we became very interested in that space.
And the interesting thing is that you're moving forward. You're not really taking the carbon neutral claim. You're saying that you're phrasing it in a way that's a little bit softer, but steers away from all of the kind of critiques that are coming from some quarters. I think, let me segue briefly into our government contingents here. Our government are both of you together, I think, because you deal with government, and you wait for you to get your of the government. And I think it's because one thing we heard in the opening session that really hit me hard is how little we know about what's in peatlands. That really surprised me, and how important it is to have governments engaged in this effort to move this process forward. So maybe I'll start with you, because Anna, you can talk to what it's like to deal, what from the perspective of Conservation International, how do you engage governments, and then we can go into how the government responds to that, or what you guys are doing to try to move this whole process forward.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Thanks. Well, for us, working with the government is a must. When we're talking about wetlands, and we know that wetlands are essential elements for public resources because our public land, we know that we have to engage directly with them to ensure that we advance together towards one understanding, because that's the first step. We need to create the science, build the analysis to ensure that the government and the country understands what we have in wetlands. And this is mangroves, this is peatlands, these are coastal areas that link to estuaries. So this understanding has been essential. So the work that we have consolidated in Costa Rica is mostly on mangroves, but the first step was to understand how much mangroves do we have, what's the stock of carbon that they can integrate, what are the potential for restoring these areas, and working with the government to understand how they can integrate this knowledge into their methodologies, into their baselines, so they are enabled to account for what they have and also be responsible for what they have to do to improve their conservation and the protection. So for us, that strategic element of integration with the government is essential. The other element is working on alternative mechanisms to make it work. As Carlos Manuel mentioned it earlier, and Don Ricardo mentioned it for the case of Costa Rica, we're actually building together a PSA 2.0. What it means, we're trying to integrate other ecosystems and other services, not only carbon, but also how we integrate biodiversity, how we integrate other elements that are part of these ecosystems into these accounting that enables to channel funding, not necessarily for the government, but for the communities that are linked to these wetlands, because they are essential for its conservation, bringing alternative livelihoods that can be invested into that, bringing capacities to ensure that they conserve and restore with us on the peatlands and the wetlands in general. So those elements are now being integrated into that rethink on how we do these step forward on the PSA for mangroves, for example. And this is a blue carbon element, but we have a biodiversity element. So we are trying to think with them how we build from their experience as governments. And as you know, we are also, Costa Rica just won this Earthshore Prize because this program, what we want is to bring it to the next level and to say how we integrate these ecosystems into these mechanisms for effective management, restoration, and bringing others, because as we have been talking about private sector, this for us is key as well. Maybe at smaller scale, Costa Rica has a smaller scale investment of private sector, but this is also small public-private partnerships that have been built with companies linked to these areas, and that they know the community needs these ecosystems for their livelihoods. They have been investing with us and with local governments, with this a lower scale, but that may not be too big, but is big for the communities that are there and for what the country wants to build. That is the model for sustainability in the long term. So that's what I will say.
And Ligia, how does the government respond to these demands and pressures that are coming down onto you from the private sector and also the offering of engagement from groups like Conservation International?
Primero que nada, mis disculpas porque les voy a hablar en español. Trataré de hablar lo más despacio posible. Panamá entregó su segundo informe bienal a la Convención de Cambio Climático en marzo de este año. Se evidencia allí que Panamá es carbono negativo. Nosotros tenemos el 64.5% de nuestro territorio cubierto por bosques y rastrojos. Dentro de estos bosques están también los manglares y dentro de los rastrojos también están las turberas. Tenemos una gran turbera en la provincia de Bocas del Toro. El planteamiento entonces fue cómo creamos procedimientos, estándares, una normativa clara para que pudiéramos crear las bases del mercado de carbono en Panamá. En este sentido, lanzamos en el mes de junio el programa Reduce tu huella, con su primera etapa, que es la huella corporativa. Eso fue en junio y hemos logrado a la fecha que 70 corporaciones se inscriban en el programa Reduce tu huella, de las cuales 56 con el compromiso de ser carbono neutral al 2050 y una de ser carbono neutral al 2030. Esta es la autoridad del Canal de Panamá. Este programa ha continuado ahora trabajando todos los estándares, las normativas, los procedimientos para los municipios, para los productos y para los proyectos. Pero acá viene a colación fundamentalmente en lo que hemos estado hablando, en la huella de carbono corporativa, pública y privada, que va a jugar un papel importantísimo en la segunda etapa, que es lo que no puedes reducir, pues lo tendrás que compensar. Nosotros tenemos un interés fundamental en que se pueda compensar en manglares, pastos marinos y turberas, porque son donde mayor captura de carbono tenemos, y lo que nos da entonces la posibilidad del reto que ahora tenemos de permanecer carbono negativo hasta el 2050. No podemos aspirar a ser carbono neutral porque retrocederíamos. Así que nuestra mayor aspiración es poder continuar ser carbono negativo. Estas compensaciones tienen que ser monitoreadas, verificadas, reportadas y certificadas. Vamos a trabajar fundamentalmente con las certificaciones Gold Standard o la certificación Vera, que son las que incluyen con más sensibilidad, diría yo, a las comunidades originarias de los lugares donde se va a hacer la compensación. Y nosotros tenemos una gran población indígena en nuestro país, con comarcas muy amplias, que tienen grandes territorios. Y aún en aquellas donde no haya población indígena, pues tendremos también la posibilidad de trabajar con las comunidades, por ejemplo, afrodescendientes o mixtas que haya también allí. Pero repito, tiene que ser un proceso muy transparente. Todo esto lo vamos a tener en la plataforma de transparencia climática que vamos a lanzar a finales de noviembre de este año, donde van a estar todas las empresas que ya integran el programa de Reduce tu Huella, cuánto es su huella de carbono, cuánto van a compensar y cuántas se van a ir certificando en esta compensación. La tercera etapa, que ya venimos trabajando en ella también, para sentar las bases del mercado de carbono en Panamá. No es necesariamente que tenga que ser un mercado nacional. Nosotros también tenemos la posibilidad de trabajar con cualquier mercado de carbono internacional dentro de lo que es el mercado voluntario. Y de hecho, el fortalecimiento de nuestras capacidades para esa tercera etapa la estamos recibiendo del mercado de carbono voluntario del estado de California en Estados Unidos. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you. That sets us up for the questions that are coming in. We've only got about 5 minutes to deal with these questions, and then we're going to hand it over to Jane to wrap it up. There are two questions that are far and away more popular than the others. One of them is probably a quagmire. To stick with the peatlands thing, it's about additionality. I'm going to go with the second one first, the second most popular question coming in, because I think it relates to this question. And if we can keep the answers pretty brief, that would be good. And it's, how do we avoid perverse outcomes in carbon markets for peatlands? The evidence base for the full emission budget of restoration projects is still sparse, and local verification of avoided emissions in the case of payments to avoid destruction is frequently poor. Kind of a tough one there. Anybody want to? Okay, that'll be, yeah. Actually, since I didn't get to you, that was your point. That was your topic. So I'm sorry.
Yeah. So thank you for this question. It's extremely important to guarantee environmental integrity, and at Wetlands International, we strongly believe that environmental integrity has two components. One component is ensuring high quality projects on the ground, which are additional, permanent, address leakage, etc., involve local communities, are embedded within policy and planning. And the other element is also responsible corporate climate action, which needs to follow the mitigation hierarchy. So accounting, reducing, and then offsetting residual emissions. And we have contributed to the science. We have contributed to the IPCC supplement on wetlands dating back to 2013, which is really great. We've also contributed to several VERA standards. And these show us that it actually can be done. You can calculate this and you can have real impact on the ground. We've worked in several large landscapes, in peatlands, mangroves, and these really bring real climate benefits, but also biodiversity and community benefits. So yeah, it's doable.
Yeah, and there's a question that's really gaining a lot of traction out here, and it's really about additionality. So I don't know if we can go into it, but I'll read it out and see if anybody wants to take a quick stab at it. Does the panel think there is room of accreditation for carbon credits that support good ongoing management of peatlands? How do we support those who are already doing the right thing? Should their carbon storage be recognized? It's anybody want to tackle that one, or can you do it in?
I mean, you really have to understand the concept of additionality. There's lots of different ways of considering it, but the best way to think about it is, would this activity continue to happen had I not otherwise done something? Like, you have to physically do something. Our presence, we're financing all sorts of activities in these landscapes, and those activities are contingent on non-destructive activities going forward. So the projects are constantly additional. You can conserve intact peat domes through supporting community livelihood activities, microfinance loans, training, building new sorts of economic activities outside of the physical peat dome, but that finance is contingent on non-destructive activities within the peat dome. So this sort of activity will constantly be additional. It will always be additional. It's not going to happen by magic. That's what I say.
I think that there is another question here on the SBTI recently set new standards and criteria saying to achieve net zero with the SBTI, emissions that are not possible to cut, the final 5 to 10%, have to be neutralized through carbon removals. What does the panel think about this position, the effect it might have on flows of private finance into peatlands, the ways to work with this limitation? Looks like
Yeah.
D? Okay.
Our position is that the IPCC recommends that we need everything. We have an urgent problem to solve. It's not going away anytime soon. And to reject any particular type of activity is just wrong. And we've been anti-SBTI recommendations for quite some time. We think it confuses what the issue is. We believe that payment for ecosystem services is extremely important no matter what happens. And that's as important for a wetland, or a peat swamp, and avoiding conversion to agriculture as it is to putting a clean cook stove into someone's home and avoiding the use of the wood that they might have to have. Absolutely, we believe that carbon credits, a ton emitted here can be reduced by avoiding it someplace else or by removing it. We are completely against the whole idea of the removal emphasis.
Well, I think how can you be quick?
Super quick. Just to follow up on that, at net zero in 2050, what goes up must come down. We need to be removing what goes up. I completely agree with that. But right now we're in a deforestation crisis, more than 12 million hectares being lost a year. To suggest that should not be financed through avoided emissions is really, really dangerous. Yeah, I just wanted to add that.
Yeah. We need to first slow things down and then get to the next phase. Lots of follow-ups in my head. Maybe I can follow up with all you guys individually, and I'll have a lot of episodes of Bionic Planet that we can put you on, if I can plug. But I wanted to hand it off to Jane here, who can wrap us up. Sorry. I don't know if I can continue going. I think we have a hard stop coming up. I don't know. Can I keep going? Okay. Well, we'll hand it off to Jane. And sorry, I didn't mean to startle you.
That's all right. Okay, well, this is a tough task. I feel we've just got going in the discussion. Actually, it's really a pity we've got to stop. So do continue afterwards. Well, try to bring something together. What I think everybody agrees on is that we need now a transition that enables us to conserve and restore peatlands at scale for carbon reasons, but for all the other associated reasons. As was said very clearly by Kate, this needs to be a just transition that leads to just sharing of the benefits. So that underpins all. And this links with all the points made about transparency and rigorous principles and standards across the board. At the national level, what we heard is that governments are really stepping out and through policies incentivizing private sector to come on board. And this seems to be working quite well. And there are good attempts to join up in a landscape the benefits of investing through carbon, through this particular opportunity, with all the other benefits that are needed through peatlands for water, for livelihoods, for biodiversity. So that's pretty encouraging. The presentation from Jeff reminded us that we're facing really some enormous challenges, the incoherence of policies that are really pushing investments in completely the other direction. So bringing policy coherence, getting the conventions to really work together. And I think here what is also on the table is that it's not only this convention, but connecting peatlands and how it's dealt with by the Climate Convention, with the Biodiversity Convention, and indeed even the UNCCD deals with land degradation. So if they could all say the same thing about peatlands, there's a lot of money that could go in the right direction. So that's an action point. But also market failure, which is a bigger challenge, and the perverse incentives. So these are the big ones to tackle. On the other side, we heard that one of the incentives is to enable benefits to the local economy through peatland management. And of course, that's a no-regret activity. And from the companies here, well, we heard that companies are taking some very different stances towards the voluntary carbon market for their own good reasons. And the main issue around it is the uncertainties. It's also the public debate. So, yeah, tackling standards, bringing more of a consensus around where the voluntary carbon market fits in the bigger picture, and how this can be, how it can tackle the integrity issue. What we heard from Permian Global was that if we can get this tackled, then we can get predictable finance streams, and we can get a fair market price, and that is the route to scaling. So I see the enormous challenges, and we shouldn't underestimate them. But on the other hand, I see there's room for a lot of optimism. The analysis is very clear. So thank you all the panelists for all your wisdom and sharing this session. It's been very rich, and I think hopefully this is just the beginning of solving all of these issues and moving forward together. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Jane. And we actually do have one more. We have one more little thing for you. We have a video on peatland restoration in Brazil that might be worth sticking around for. Let me just get out of the way here, and you can start it up.
O fogo dentro da RPPN entrou pela divisa norte da reserva. Toda a equipe já estava aqui próximo mesmo, já estava em combate na na divisa da cerca mesmo. Mas a gente já tinha todo um acero feito que a gente faz todo ano no entorno da RPPN, já para conter mesmo o fogo, para combate de incêndio, usado para isso, né?
Eu tenho 40 anos, né, desde que eu moro aqui, que nasci, moro aqui no Pantanal. Desse tipo não tinha visto não, tragédia grande desse tipo não. Tanto faz como a seca, como o fogo, né? Se alastrou muito rápido e queimou muito. Muita judiação, muita malvadeza com os animais, com as árvores mesmo. Tem lugar aí que as árvores vai durar uns 50, 60 anos para recuperar. É um sentimento muito grande, porque para nós pantaneiros, nossa convivência com os animais é muito próximo, né? Então é muito sentimento para nós.
Nos últimos anos a gente tem tido muitas ocorrências de incêndio, mas nada se compara ao que a gente enfrentou em 2020 e está enfrentando ainda. E com essa força a gente está então se reerguendo, né? Traçando novos desafios, novos objetivos. E a gente está conseguindo assim, perceber que essa recuperação ela vai acontecer e que a gente tem como fazer com que ela aconteça da melhor forma, né? De uma forma mais rápida, mais inteligente, né? Trabalhando com ciência, trabalhando com dados e trabalhando em parceria. A gente precisa fazer com que esse registro se torne uma ação futura de planejamento, de trabalho integrado, se aproximar mais. Eu acho que os momentos de crise a gente também se integra mais, né? Se reúne essas forças e esse é o caminho que a gente acredita.